Moving on to the third aspect of Chapter 2 of Desjardins' Introduction to Business Ethics. Let's recall that there are three types of ethics. They are ethics of consequences, ethics of principles, and ethics of character. In this session, we discuss the ethics of consequences, which the best representative of that is utilitarianism. Ethics of consequences, let us note, is based on pleasure and pain. And we will look at a criticism of ethics of consequences. In the subsequent sections, we'll look at an ethics of principles, which is Kantianism, as well as an ethics of character, which is virtue ethics. We'll also look at the criticisms of those as well. Meanwhile, we're going to look at utilitarianism based on pleasure and pain as an ethics of consequences, and we'll look at the criticism of it as well. Let's move on. So, ethics of consequences concerns itself with happiness and suffering. Like, if we were to speak about the consequences of actions, we're pretty much thinking about how much happiness they produce, how much suffering they produce. Happiness and suffering is a more elevated way of speaking about something more basic than that, pleasure and pain. So yes, ethics of consequences concerns itself with happiness and suffering, but really with pleasure and pain, because those are the things we will talk about if we're going to speak about consequences of action, right? We can talk about all kinds of consequences, but ultimately it comes down to how much pleasure did those actions produce? How much pain did those actions produce? Or rather, how much happiness and how much suffering those actions produced, right? We're going to evaluate consequences of actions. We're going to look at happiness and suffering that they produce. All right, so let's try it again. Just reading. Ethics of consequences concerns itself with happiness and suffering. Happiness and suffering, or pleasure and pain, are two basic human values, and it is also that by which we measure the consequences of actions. When we ask about the consequences of an action, we ask about how much pleasure or happiness and pain or suffering an action has produced. Remember, in Chapter 2, we introduced the thought that in order for a theory to be a theory of ethics, it has to do with furthering of some human good. Well, the human good or purpose identified here by utilitarianism is that of happiness, right? So, yeah, we're talking about an ethical theory since it concerns itself with the fundamental human purpose of happiness. One basic school of morals, utilitarianism, takes all of the above seriously and claims that pleasure and pain, or happiness and suffering, are all that matters for human beings. Right? Utilitarianists are going to say that there are all kinds of talks about ethics, but a lot of it is misleading or sentimentalism or just brainwashing. Look, the only thing that really matters is pleasure and pain. We are, after all, living animal beings, right? And so living animal beings concern themselves with pleasure and pain. So one basic school of morals, utilitarianism, takes the above seriously and claims that pleasure and pain, or happiness and suffering, are all that matters for human beings ultimately. The good of everything else is measured by these. In other words, was this action a good one? Well, it depends on whether it has produced a lot of pleasure. Was this action a bad one? That would depend on whether it has produced a lot of suffering. Thus, a good action is the one that maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering, or maximizes benefits and reduces harms. And all of this is a discussion of utilitarianism. So, what makes the above theory of utilitarianism moral and not simply egoism about my pleasures and pain is an additional idea that equal amounts of happiness or suffering in different beings matter equally. My happiness and suffering is no more and no less important than that of strangers. And the happiness and suffering of people I like is just as important as that of people I don't like. That is what makes this thinking about consequences into moral thinking. It is impartial and objective in that sense. Let's recall, in order for a theory to be a theory of morals, it has to do with some fundamental human good, in this case, pleasure and pain, and it has to be impartial. And utilitarianism passes both of those criteria insofar as it looks to maximize happiness for all beings, not just for me or for people I like. The school of thought that subscribes to all of the above is utilitarianism, articulated by two British men in the middle of 19th century, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. It is called utilitarianism since the moral worth of an action is measured in terms of its utility. How much happiness over suffering an action brings about for how many beings. Thus, a moral action on the utilitarian account is the one that benefits or makes happy as many human beings as possible, while harming or making suffer as few human beings as possible. This action must produce the best outcome or utility out of all available actions. In the business context, we would say that a business operates morally on the utilitarian account if its actions produce the maximum of happiness with as little suffering as possible for as many beings as possible out of all available actions. Notably, it's the consequences of actions and not the intentions that make actions moral or immoral, right? Whatever your intentions are behind your actions, the consequences and the utility of that action is actually by the effect on me of your actions. So in consequentialism, it is not the intentions that we're concerned with, but consequences. Okay, let me give a little bit of an illustration here. So here come utilitarians, and this is roughly what they're thinking. Look, we have to make a decision between option A and option B, right? So how do we know which would be the moral decision, to choose A or to choose B? Well, A makes 50 people happy, and B makes 25 people happy. Which action will be the moral action according to utilitarianism? Action A, because it produces more happiness in the world than does action B, right? This is a moral decision because it is concerned with the fundamental human purpose of happiness and because it's looking at the whole thing impartially. It doesn't matter whether I happen to be among these 50 people here or these 25 people here. It doesn't matter whether people I like happen to be among these 50 people here or these 25 people here. Right? So impartiality is what happens in utilitarianism. Let's complicate things a little bit. Let's say action A makes 50 people happy and it makes 20 people suffer. On the other hand, action B makes 25 people happy and it makes 10 people suffer. All right, we've complicated it a bit, but look, the net total of this whole thing is, let's assign a value to this. 50 people are happy, the value here is plus 50. Makes 20 people suffer, the value here is minus 20. B makes 25 people happy, the value here is plus 25. And it makes 10 people suffer, the value here is minus 10. All right, so what we're now going to do is now we are going to calculate the total utility of each of the actions. So the total utility of action A is plus 50 minus 20 is plus 30. And the total utility of action B is plus 15, right? Plus 25 minus 10 is plus 15. So which action has the greatest utility? Action A. So this would be the morally right action to choose. Why? Because it has the greatest utility. All right, so what are we doing here? We're looking at the consequences, and we're looking at the consequences in terms of happiness and suffering, and that is a fundamental human purpose, and we're doing so impartially. It doesn't matter whether I or people I like happen to be among the 20 people that would suffer here, or among 50 people that would be happy here. Right? All right, so that is utilitarian calculation of the best or moral action to choose. Criticism of utilitarianism. While utilitarianism satisfies the two criteria we listed for moral theories during our previous lecture, maximizing basic human value and being impartial, it merits a serious criticism. It can justify harming few for the sake of benefiting of many. It can justify slavery or child labor or other forms of exploitation. We can well conceive of how greater overall benefits are produced by employing 3 people to produce goods for 100 people, rather than having those 100 people work to satisfy themselves. In the first case, only 3 people undergo the harm of losing leisure. In the second case, 100 people undergo the harm of losing leisure. Clearly, the utility would be maximized if we have 3 people slaving away for 100. So, as rational and sensible as utilitarianism may have seemed, it's got this fundamental criticism of it as well. Utilitarianism runs into trouble of not respecting individual rights by justifying harming a few for the benefits of the many, right? That's what we would say. Utilitarianism doesn't really care about individuals, it just cares about total numbers. Ethics of principles, which we're going to look at next, offers a remedy to this criticism of utilitarianism by offering an ethic of inviolable individual rights.